Has debate jargon become too much of a chore? Does every round you enter leave you wanting to know more? Well, look no further because one clap is the key. It's time for Professor Graham and Kevin's ABCs. Hello debaters, welcome back to another episode of Professor Graham's ABCs of Debate. I'm Professor Graham, here with my pal Kevin, and today the word of the day is going to be kicking. So without further ado, let's jump into it. We'll be breaking this episode into 3 parts. Why do we kick arguments, how to kick arguments, and what are some complications with doing so? Kicking arguments is one of the most important skills to add to your toolkit. It serves a few different purposes. Number 1, we want to start narrowing down for efficiency. While going into the final rebuttal with all your arguments sounds cool in theory, remember the goal of the final rebuttal is to narrow down to your most essential arguments and get a decisive victory by explaining things well, rather than hoping your disaster of a flow edges out a win for you. Second off, we want to narrow down for strategic purposes. If you know that a position is unwinnable, but your opponents spend 2 minutes attacking it because they assume it's a threat, getting rid of the dead parts of your case instead of stringing them along means that you've gained a massive time advantage over your opponents. Even if you're getting obliterated on a disadvantage or some other contention, as long as they don't have any offense, there's no downside to pretending like it didn't even happen. Now that we know why we kick certain arguments, we gotta learn how to do so. Kicking arguments involves the process of getting rid of an argument by conceding your opponent's attacks on your case. For example, if they attack your China war impact by saying that war isn't likely, kicking that position is really easy. All you needed to do is concede that a China war scenario is unlikely, and voila! You no longer have to worry about going for that argument because you agree with your opponent. It sounds simple, and it's because it is. This also serves a strategic benefit for debates with a lot of moving parts. Taking that example from earlier, if you both run a China war impact in your case, and your opponents argue that a China war is unlikely to answer your impact, then by conceding their argument is true that a China war won't happen, you've destroyed your own scenario, yes, but you've also taken out one of your opponents. This is obviously a simple example, and it's unlikely that they'll be reading explicit impact defense to a scenario that you're both reading, but sometimes people don't think about how their arguments interact with each other, and you can capitalize on that. The best part here is, you can kick out of any defensive attacks against your positions. For example, if you have a contention/advantage about how your affirmative would improve the economy, you should concede any attack along the link chain of your position. You could concede the uniqueness, that the economy is doing well now, you could concede the link, that you improve the economy, or you could concede the impact, that a good economy deters war. Conceding any part of that story gets you out of the entire position, and you can move on with your life. Think about it from a story perspective. If you think about the contention/advantage as a story about the economy being bad now, but improving it prevents wars, then if your opponents win the uniqueness, for example, then the economy is already doing well and preventing those wars. Likewise, if they win that you don't link to improving the economy, it means the affirmative has no effect on those issues at all. Conceding any defensive attack on these contentions gets you out of these arguments. Well, I may have oversimplified just a little bit. There are a lot of scenarios where you need to be very careful about when you concede arguments and which ones you decide to. First off, you need to concede defense. We'll talk more about these concepts when we make it further down the alphabet, but for simplicity's sake, we want to be conceding arguments that disprove our scenarios, not ones that prove our scenarios are bad. Taking the economy, for example, again, if one of our opponent's arguments against the DA is that a bad economy is good because growth makes conflict more likely, then that's an impact turn. If we concede that argument, we 100% concede a scary impact that we get no new responses to because we agreed with our opponents. There's no takesy-backsies. Second off, be wary of straight turns. Straight turns, probably deserving of their own entire video, are when your opponents basically steal your entire contention. Going back to the econ scenario again, let's say your opponents make the arguments that the economy is doing well now, but that the affirmative actually makes it worse. It might seem like both of these are defensive arguments against the DA, and in isolation, they are, but together, they are pseudo-stealing your entire contention. Let's play the story out in our opponent's world. Now the story of the DA is that the economy is doing really good right now, the affirmative tanks it, and economic growth prevents wars. If you concede any part of their story, you've basically read a contention for your opponent that you can't argue against, and it's GG. I have terrible news. Usually, you don't. If your opponent straight turn your contention, you have two options. Number one, if they have impact defense on that position, like economic growth doesn't solve war, then you can concede that, and even if they're turning your contention, they agree with you that there's no impact because econ decline doesn't lead to war. They said that. However, usually if your opponents know what they want to straight turn and know when they want to do it, they won't give you this liberty. Which brings us to option number two, perish. If you read a garbage DA that the opponents can straight turn, then I guess you're bringing it into the rebuttals because you played yourself. Third, when jettisoning counterplans, the easiest argument to concede is the permutation. Almost every single AF will try to perm the counterplan, so just agree with them. Say that the permutation is just a test of competition, meaning they don't get to claim ownership of your counterplane after you concede it, and move on. Fourth, you don't need to explicitly concede anything on topicality when you're dropping it. T virtually never has any offense on it, outside of weird reverse voting issues which happen once in a blue moon. So you never even need to talk about the page if you don't want to go for it. And that's all my hot tips for kicking. Kicking arguments is essential, but it's a difficult skill to master. But as hard as it can be to learn, it can be just as useful if your opponents don't know how to deal with things. Try reading multiple counterplans and jettisoning them to get a time advantage. Or try purely reading straight turns against certain contentions and see how your opponents react. And good luck in your next round. Well, that episode was a doozy. I sure will be kicking myself if I forgot anything. Am I right, Kevin? Dryer? I hardly know her. Every time. Hey, thanks again for watching today's episode of Professor Graham's ABCs of Debate. As always, I'm Professor Graham, and that's my pal Kevin. Yeah, if you ever need any help with debate stuff at all, my email should be right up here. Just make sure you CC your coach. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can with any debate tips that you might need. I'll drop that knowledge on you. Bam. Thanks for watching. It's been a pleasure. See y'all later.